Welcome, everybody. This is Hugh Massie, the chairman and founder of DNA Behaviour International. And today I'm hosting another one of our identity conversations. And I've got the great fortune to have with me Dan Pappas, who lives on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. Dan's got up very early this morning to talk with me, which is fantastic. And Dan's had a very interesting career being a ministry leader. He's currently an operational director for Tysers Insurance Brokers and also for an event production company called IJS Productions. And so he's got, a very interesting career background there. So Dan, just tell us a little bit more about you and how your career has progressed to where it is today.
Thanks, Hugh. It's actually really good to be here, especially having heard so much about you over the years from our mutual friend Carol. So that's good. To be honest, I ended up in ministry, but never really wanted to be in ministry in the local church. And that was partly because I had a youth leader who said God can use anybody. And so if I figured that was true, then he should use everybody else to do ministry and leave me alone to make lots of money. So I actually never really wanted to do it. And I'd done really well in high school. And in my final year of high school, God kind of dealt with that whole ministry and money thing. It's like it became a total non-compete left in my own heart. And at the end of that year, finished school, did 2 years of Rhema Bible College, which was on site at Calvary at that time. And then worked for 4 years as the youth pastor in the school. Because there's a 1,000-person sort of P to 12 school that's on the site there in Townsville, and then crossed the car park and spent 4 years as a youth pastor in the church. And then in 2015, my wife and I and our little boy Jonathan at that stage moved to the Sunshine Coast to lead Calvary on the Sunshine Coast, and did that for 6 years, which was probably the most challenging and the most rewarding thing we'd ever done, because it was a big task and there was a lot of change that needed to happen. And it was a big property and a big facility and what had been previously a really big church. And I was 28. And so after the first few Sundays, everybody kept on commenting on how much of a baby face I had. And so I realized I've got to grow some stubble or something here. I look too young to be leading this church. And so it was the right challenge at the right time, and did that, and then resigned at the end of 2020. And had a couple of friends who said, after my 6 months of long service leave, hey, would you come and work with me? And so one of those was Jason Holmes, who we'd met through church. And at that stage, we were running the carols for Cotton Tree and Kings Beach for the mayor, which were rather large events. And Jason had just bought a production company a little bit earlier, and having sold his business to Tysers and then taking the profits from that to buy a couple of production companies. And I'd thrown him into the committee where we were sort of wrangling that leadership and all the shareholders together to get those events to happen. And after one of those meetings, Jason came up to me and he said, hey, if you weren't working for the church, would you come and work for me? Because what you're really gifted at is operations, like it's the leadership and the people part. And so the timing wasn't right then, but after I'd resigned, we sort of revisited that. And for the last 6 months or so, been involved in the operations side of Tysers for Australia and New Zealand. And then on the other side, 2 days a week as the business manager in the production company.
Yeah, so for a relatively young man, well, you're younger than I am, it's a pretty interesting career path. Mm-hmm. And you sorted out something, Dan, pretty big at the start on leaving high school, if I heard it correctly, around your career path and making money.
Yeah.
Because you at school wanted to make lots of money and be sort of left alone as far as ministry is concerned, but somehow that got dealt with. And so what did that mean, or how did that happen? when you're at 18 or 19 years old, you made that choice. Somehow you put everything in perspective for yourself.
I would say really what happened is that God spoke to me. And I don't mean that in a mystical way. I would say there's probably a half a dozen times in my life where something like that has happened. And I would describe it as an idea that didn't originate with me. So that's what I mean by God spoke to me. So to be really specific about it, it was the start of my grade 12 year. And our whole youth group had been attending a conference for the week called Planet Shakers in Brisbane. And we had a 22-hour bus ride after the final night meeting, which was lots of music, and it was 4,000 or 5,000 teenagers at this church. And we had a 22-hour bus ride going home. And I'd done this before. And so I had packed a change of clothes because everybody had been in the mosh pit, everyone's sweaty, and then you're going to sit on a bus for 22 hours. And so I'm on the bus full of a whole bunch of friends, and I've packed a change of clothes because I know an hour outside of Brisbane, the bus driver is going to stop and I'm going to get changed. And so that's what I'm thinking about. I'm thinking about, I can't wait for this first stop. I'm going to get changed. I can't believe these other guys haven't thought of doing this. And in the middle of that being my thought process, this thought drops into my heart. I look out the window of the bus and this thought drops in: when you go home, you won't go home as Daniel Pappas, the student. You'll go home as Daniel Pappas, the pastor. And at the time I thought, well, that's amazing. I'd just been asked to be the school captain that year. And so I thought, I'm going to go home and pastor my school. And as that year progressed, I realized it probably meant a little bit more than that. And so at the end of the year, I went to Bible college.
Wow. I mean, that's quite inspiring. So really, as the leader of the school captain, you really wanted to bring in a pastoral approach to your leadership at the school.
Yeah.
And I imagine that you saw yourself as the leader of the 4,000 or 5,000 kids that had participated at this event, and all the others on the bus. And by having the change of clothes, in a way, you're equipping yourselves to stand out to some degree, and be out the front.
I don't know if I thought about it quite that much at 17, but yes.
But that's how the story comes across. You were, in a way, operationally planning that trip.
Mm-hmm.
So taking that forward, and you've had a meteoric rise through Calvary Church, starting up in Townsville and then going down to the Sunshine Coast. And we're not talking small facilities, but for someone young, you've been able to take the reins and be a pastoral leader, one as a pastor, training others in leader development in the church, but also operationally managing the church. So what do you think is the gift that you've really got, that you were using, in a way, I call it your X factor, that made all that happen? And I think your friend Jason's also seen it as well.
I'd probably preface it by saying the opportunities that I've had and the chances to be able to rise were really oftentimes opportunities that I shouldn't have been given necessarily because of my age. But they were huge amounts of trust invested by other people, which was really more about them than it was about me. And also, when you're leading a church and most of the people who are in the church are old enough to be your parents, that doesn't so much say something about you. It says something about those people who are gracious enough to allow somebody young like that to be able to lead. So, but I suppose the thing that I've always landed on my feet with is when it comes to people and when it comes to opportunities to lead. I haven't had to try to do that. That just kind of has naturally come. And I've always found people fascinating. So I suppose that's where, when I first started talking to Carol about DNA behavior, I found that so intriguing, because there is a DNA to the way that people behave and the factors that influence that.
So what do you find fascinating about people? And how have you learned to manage them?
I find everything about people fascinating. And probably in lots of different ways. Having now become a parent,
Yeah.
I find that fascinating in a totally new way, because these little personalities start appearing in your children who you raise exactly the same way. And yet for Jonathan and Sophie, they're very different little children.
Yeah.
And so that's a new dimension again on that. So I think I've always been a naturally curious person. And so my parents used to joke at the dinner table that if I was telling a story, they would say, Daniel, is this a long story or is this a short story? My dad used to tell people, if you ask Daniel what the time is, he'll tell you how the clock works. And so I think I've always been naturally curious. And I think the most fascinating thing to be curious about is people.
So when you've been operating, serving, servant leadership as a leader, whether it was at school or in the church environments, how have you treated the different people that and in different contexts that have walked on your path? So do you feel, let me ask this question, do you feel, I'll put it this way to help you, do you feel that it's compassionate leadership, or you've in some intuitive way looked for the gift that each person has and you've been able to just relate to them on their terms to get them, motivate them to do something? Because you've obviously had people doing things for you and walking in some sort of straight line, relatively speaking, behind you. You've got alignment.
Yeah, look, and for Elise and I, the thing that we've always said is, if people matter, then we should put people first. And so I think probably some of the time you look back and go, wow, we really did do some incredible things. But at the time we weren't really thinking so much about that. We were just counting the people that God had given and finding out what their gifts and talents were and getting those involved. And ministries and church areas and departments grew really from that. They grew from finding out, all right, who has God given us and what does that tell us about what he's asking us to do?
So you've been curious about people. You've recognized, and you can see, and that for your own children, like I do with mine. I'm glad I had DNA behavior at my disposal and learned enough about it to manage two very different kids. But you've been very curious about people, and as a sort of an approach, you've learned to put people first, and seem to have intuitively always done that, and found their gifts. But what else is it about you that, okay, you put them in positions, or you get them doing a task or a role or working in a committee or whatever it is, why they are loyal to you and stayed there and made their part of the action or church grow?
Yeah. And of course, most of the people that you're leading and motivating are volunteers. They don't have to do this.
Yeah, that's right. That's even harder.
Yeah. So for the Sunshine Coast, to sort of put that in perspective, that was a church of about 5,000 people in the database, and who would call that church home. And that would mean about 1,300 people in weekend services. But it was about 600 volunteers at any time over that month. So 10 staff. So 10 staff, 600 volunteers. But I've always kind of felt like if you need to care more about how people are doing than what they are doing. And so if it's just about the task, that's going to wear really thin really quick. But if you've taken a personal interest in that person, and that's genuine, you genuinely know like what's happening in their family and how are they doing and how are their kids going. And if you care more about how they're doing than what they're doing, then people generally gather around that. Yes.
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but that's where I was going before with asking you about compassionate leadership.
Yeah.
Because it seems that you're a pretty compassionate leader in terms of caring about them and how they are versus what they're doing.
Yeah. Which is kind of stitched into the fabric of how a church should work. But interestingly, especially as a church becomes big and there becomes privilege at different levels of leadership, that's sometimes the thing that's lost first. And I'd sort of watched that happen at different times and thought, you know what, I don't ever want to do that. No matter what we're leading, regardless of its size or its scale, it's got to be about caring more about how people are doing than what they're doing. And people stick around if their lives are getting better.
Yeah, so it's about people growth in there, and if you're caring about what they're doing and they're growing. But what happens when the person might be very well intentioned, the volunteer might be very well intentioned, but they're off track with what they're doing?
Yeah.
How do you deal with them to get them back on track?
You be really honest.
Yeah. So honest feedback.
Yeah, honest feedback. And I think that's about giving that honest feedback in a timely manner, because often people avoid those difficult conversations, thinking it'll be kinder not to say anything, but ultimately it ends up in a bigger mess. And so my rule of thumb was always, if you see something, just address it. Give yourself 24 hours and address it. And the times where I was reluctant to do that or didn't get around to doing that always came back to bite me. So, and the other thing I found interesting with that is that when you do come and you do that in a sincere way and you challenge a person and you draw a line and you say, all right, this is what it means to live above that line. This is what it means to live below that line. But the decision is yours. So if I'm asking you to do something that actually is not something you want to do, or is not something you feel capable of doing, and I can't encourage you there, that's fine. Just do the other thing that you're doing. I always found people were really appreciative of that, because generally in life, most people aren't that willing to be honest with you.
Yeah. So how do you get them to be honest with you? Because I think what you're doing is you're setting a line and saying, this is where the line is. And then you've got to get them back on the right side of the line. But so you're having honest conversations, but what's happening in the honest conversation with them to get them back on track?
Yeah.
Or to say enough's enough.
Yeah. I think you've got to have enough relationship in the bank to actually get that to happen.
Yeah.
Otherwise you just bankrupt the relationship straight away. I remember having, when I'd first moved to the Sunshine Coast, there were two ladies, both of which were kind of old enough to be my mum. And I realized one was on staff and was working in a finance department. The other person was a volunteer, but a very key volunteer, running all of the cafe. And I kind of observed there's like some sort of, they're both very strong women, and there was like this tension between them. And I couldn't quite put my finger on it. And then as I sort of uncovered a little bit more, I realized that actually everyone had been aware of this tension. It had been there 6 months before I'd arrived. Just no one was willing to sit down with them because they were worried that if you open this conversation, both women would take your head off. So I remember, and it was obviously when there's that tension, it starts to have a flow-on effect into the teams of people who are involved in those different areas. And so I remember sitting them down and saying, hey, look, we just need to have this conversation. And I'm trying not to laugh, because I'm sitting there going, I've had this conversation 1,000 times as a youth pastor, except for this woman would have been 16 and this girl would have been 15, but it's the same conversation, just with two middle-aged ladies, and realizing people really aren't that different. They just get older. And so that was one of the early, like, all right, this is a tension conversation that just needs to happen. And if I don't have it, I think this is the other thing. If you're the leader, then everybody else can see the same problem, right? But generally it's the leader's responsibility to address it. And when the leader doesn't address it, everybody else is thinking, can they not see it? Or are they just not willing to lead? So there's an expectation leaders lead, and everyone's watching to see if that's actually going to happen.
Yeah, I think you're right. Everybody else in the team knows. They know when there's some bad energy there.
Yeah.
And they're usually, everybody else is waiting for the leader to step up and get it dealt with in some way. And they're looking for you to do it in a respectful way as well, and not blowing your top. But, when you're talking to, whether it's the 15-year-old and 16-year-old kid, in the leadership school, or you're talking to warring adults, and you're sitting them down and you want to have this direct conversation. Are you telling them a story in the middle of it? How are you disarming it? Or are you just coming in straight on?
Yeah. I've found that if it's going to be a tense conversation, people already know what this is going to be about. Most people aren't going to be surprised. So you just let all the air out at the start by saying, hey, can I have a really difficult conversation? Or can I have an awkward conversation here? I would really like to get you both together because there's some tension here that's starting to bubble over. And let's resolve this before it gets any worse. I'm sure that's something that you really want. So both people are coming to the meeting knowing what it is. And sometimes I find, even if it's something that may be a little bit more of a surprise, just putting all the air out at the start and saying, can I have a conversation with you that might be a little bit difficult to have? Kind of puts everyone at ease, as opposed to when you're trying to be really polite and someone said, and you have to address something with someone and they know that you're addressing something. They're like, oh, am I in trouble for something? No. Is something wrong? No. It's just, there's little, and you're already sort of on the back foot, as opposed to saying, can I just have a conversation with you that might be a little bit awkward, but I think it's really necessary.
Yeah. I mean, to me, Dan, this is fascinating because from your business DNA style, you took our discovery online, and the feedback online is that you are an initiator, and initiators are normally very goal-driven. Usually, for most part, it's usually all about the goals, extremely direct communicators, which you clearly are, and you are also goal-driven, but you're bringing a dimension to leadership also here that's very relational, that you seem to have learned very early on, or naturally very early on. But not all initiators are that way. A lot of them are, it's my way or the highway. Whereas it seems you've been able to line up what the goal is, and then, through direct but compassionate communication and relationship building, get people to go along towards the line. That's how I'm hearing it. Because when we work with leaders, we're always teaching them the balance between relationships and results. You would be inherently a results-based leader, but you've learned from very early on, which a lot of others need more help on. I think I needed help early on getting to the relationship side, because there's no, as you said, you can't go very far in getting results if you've got no relationship capital in the bank. Yeah.
But do you know what? I'd probably say two things to that. One is I'm very grateful for my wife.
Yeah.
Who I remember early on when we were married, and I'd be on the phone talking to somebody about something that we needed to do, and she'd be in the background whispering, ask them how they're doing. And I'm like, yes, that's right. Yes. And so I can't really take credit for that. That's probably Elise's influence. But I think the other part is, for us personally, between Jonathan and Sophie is 5 years gap. And there's also 5 miscarriages that happened. Jonathan was kind of miraculous, and we didn't realize just how miraculous he really was. And then we had 5 recurrent miscarriages before eventually Sophie was born. And I think there is a degree of empathy that comes from pain. Yeah. And when you realize every person has got pain, and we've experienced that, then that produces in you, as sort of an after effect, a degree of empathy that you just kind of can't manufacture.
Yeah, and you've clearly had to learn that with your wife, and obviously she's been a good coach on the side.
Yes.
To ensure that you're putting relationship capital in the bank, and slowing it down and saying, okay, how are you doing? But nevertheless, you haven't backed off from the conversation, and you clearly know what it means to be in a difficult situation. Because sometimes the reason I found that people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing is because they've got a tricky life situation going on.
Yeah,
and you need somewhat. You don't need to know all the details, but you sort of need to know is that if that's what's happening, it makes having that conversation easier.
Yes.
But it seems to me, Dan, that, pulling some of this together, you're good at well, not good, you're outstanding at managing people. You've got a desire to be the what I call the upfront leader, and you seem to know how to manage operationally whether it's a church facility or an entertainment facility, whatever facility it is, a massive equipment, if you want to call it that, or massive assets. But it seems to me it's more the people side rather than the, if you want to call it the asset management side of it, that turns you on. Would I be right on that? I mean, you seem to know you could bring in the right people to get the assets managed, but it's the people part that's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
But how do you want people in the future to remember you as a, whether it's in a way, I think you probably will always be doing ministry in some way, even if you're in the commercial sector. In a way, leadership and sort of your purposeful in way, some way, be ministry and sowing into people. If I've got it right. But how do you want to be remembered by others? How do you want others to see you?
It's kind of a funny question, because in some ways I really don't mind if they do.
They don't see you, yeah. Okay, because you're introverted, being or reserved, being an initiator.
And so, look, I've always felt, especially in the time that we're leading the church, but even now that we're not leading a church, that we ought to live our lives in a way that makes the Church of Jesus stronger 100 years from now. But 100 years from now, no one's going to remember who we were. And that's kind of nice too. But hopefully we've done enough in that time that when people look back and say, man, thank goodness for those guys and for the vision and for the effort they put in all those years ago to set us up for now. I think in terms of how would I like to be remembered, I hope there's enough humility there that it's not about me. I probably, the other side of that coin is, I remember sitting with a guy who was 65, and he was a pastor, and I was attending his father's funeral, and he got up to give the eulogy, to talk about his dad. And Jonathan was maybe 3 or 4 years old at the time. And I didn't know this man's dad, but I knew him and I was there to support him. And I remember sitting there thinking, what will Jonathan say years from now when he's potentially doing my eulogy? And that kind of put into perspective what I was doing and what I was leading. That all that stuff was important, but it was temporal. But it was probably more about how my son remembered me and how my wife remembered me, and potentially in the future, how my grandkids remember me. That would be more important than maybe what I achieved or the accolades that I got along the way.
Yeah, so you don't want to be necessarily in the limelight, right? But you are interested in helping others flourish in their life, whether it's the volunteers, another leader in the church, and your children and your wife. But somewhere there, that's your identity, because you are the leader. I imagine you don't have to be in the pulpit at a church every weekend, but at the same time, you want to be recognised as the person that makes it all work.
Yeah,
and makes it work from a people point of view. So, am I getting it closer?
Yeah, you are.
But to me, how do we, if we sort of nail this down a little bit, is it, to me, what I've been hearing is compassionate-based leadership. That's, people-centric is what Dan Pappas is.
That's probably pretty accurate.
Yeah, and maybe that's enough. That's enough for now, because I think that the compassion's very strong. The drive to understand people, be curious about them, but also not have the fear to ask some questions about how are they doing, and okay, you're off track. So what are we going to do to get on track? Seems to be a natural act for you.
Yeah.
And it's more about how they are than whether the task actually gets done.
Well, it's kind of both, because the task still needs to get done, whether it's done by them or someone else.
Yep. Okay. That's good to clarify that. Yep.
Yeah.
So both have got to get done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But let's do it in a way that takes everyone on the journey and gathers people at the same time.
Yeah. So do you sort of see yourself as as what I call a journey-based leader or a compassion, I suppose it's a compassionate leader who takes people on the journey.
Yeah.
To achieve goals.
When we moved to the Sunshine Coast, Campbell Newman had just been thrown out of state government. And he got thrown out, not because he was making bad decisions. Probably the decisions he was making were really good for the state, but he just didn't know how to communicate it and take everyone on the journey.
Yeah.
And it was like this really pivotal thing that had just happened as we were taking leadership of this church, where there was a lot of change to be made, but it needed to be done in a way that brought, if the ship is bigger, you got to turn the circle wider. And so it was watching that going, all right, the decisions were right, but he didn't take everyone on the journey to help them understand why he was making them. At least that was my impression of it. And so I want to do that differently. I think one of the things I admired about Jason is, who I'm working for now, is his ability to collect people over time. That some of the guys he's working with, he's known for forever, and he's just sort of collected them along the way, which I think is a really interesting attribute to be able to have, that people enjoy working with you. And he's a very goal-orientated guy and highly motivated, and most people can't keep up with his pace, to be quite frank.
Yeah.
And yet he collects people over time who want to be around him.
So do you see part of what you do, just saying that, all of that? So in a way, well, just coming back, Jason is a guy that gathers people in there. People are inspired by him in some way, but they're also inspired by you. And do you see, but in a different way, it seems to me he gets the people in and you're the one who's going to keep them together. And do you see, though, that an important part of what you do, Dan, is change management?
Yeah, I think looking back over the stuff that Elise and I have done and led, it seems like we've always come in to be able to change something and move it forward. So probably at the time, not so much. I would never have described myself that way, but looking back, that's probably very true.
Yeah, because I think that if I linked compassion, change management, and leadership, that's getting closer to the mark of what you do, because change management can sometimes be rough. It doesn't need to be. It can be done with compassion.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's good. So just as we wrap up, is there anything that you would like to say to our listeners, or advice you'd like to offer other young people going into life, building their careers, stepping up as leaders? A book people should read, or a podcast? Anything that you want to say, just to wrap up?
In terms of books, I think anything written by Patrick Lencioni is definitely worth reading. And they're the easiest leadership books to read because they're all written as fables with the theory as the last chapter at the end. And so I've become a huge fan of Patrick Lencioni. But the other one, which I haven't told you this, and I know this is not the point of this interview, but I'd say to actually do some of the DNA behavior stuff. I remember we did this because this is a few years ago now, and we did it because of our mutual friend, Carol, who works for you, had been talking to my wife, Elise, and Elise said, hey, I want us to do this profiling thing. And so I thought, oh, well, that sounds like a good idea. And so we sit down for the interview, having filled out the questionnaires and whatever. And when we sit down, Carol nails it from the start. She says, all right, so before we get started, Elise, you've read through the entire report now. You've got lots of questions about that. And Dan, you haven't even read the report yet. You're not going to read the report. You're coming for the big blows right now. And Elise looked at me and we're like, wow, this is really accurate. So she had my full attention from that point on for the conversation. And so I'd say do anything you can to learn and grow as a leader. And I actually found what you guys do with DNA behavior really helpful.
Well, I think that's fantastic. And I appreciate you saying that, because if you're curious about people, then we've got the insights in our system to help you be even more curious and ask even more questions, and crack that nut when people are in corners, or you're in a corner of how are you doing, and how you ask that question to a person in a difficult conversation.
Yeah.
DNA can really help with that. And probably then for you to know ahead of time where they're going to go with the answer. So thank you, Dan. It's been great spending time with you. And, I wish you every success as you continue to step up as a leader.
Thanks so much, Hugh.